Okay. Today's episode is going to be huge. Exciting times. I know I keep saying it, but today is where it all goes down. In this episode, if I manage to squeeze it all in, we are going to create a full account system. Meaning that users can register an account in the chat using some register command. They can log into that account. And when they leave, that account will be saved into a file. And when they join again or the server is restarted, so across server restarts and across client reconnects, this data will be persisted and they can load their data again. So we can use that and combine it with our level system so players can farm some level, save it in an account, and some time later they can join again and restore their state. So that is very exciting, and it's a common thing that server modders like to do. So we are working on the server side, but like this whole concept of saving state in a file can be used everywhere. But we are going to look specifically at a server side, so to say, city-like or level mod-like account implementation. Okay, so let's keep the intro short. We have a lot of stuff to do. I hope you watched all the episodes about chat commands, about the game controller, about file IO, and you have a level system in your code. Then you're good to go, because we are going to use all of it today. And let's get right into it. So let's open the code. And let's start with a command to register an account. So we want that chat command where a player can type in /register username password. Cool. So where do we create chat commands? As you remember, it's in game controller.agent.cpp in both those files. Okay, so if we scroll down in the file game controller, it's located under game server game controller.cpp. As you remember, we have our chat commands here. So let's uncomment the example command, the slash and the star in the beginning, and then the star and the slash at the end. Wonderful. It's called example. Let's rename that to register. And down here also remove those two slashes to uncomment this line. And rename example here to register. Okay, so our chat command will be called register. That's what the user has to type in. The description that will be displayed in the autocompletion is like register an account. And then the parameters will be 2. We have 2 strings. So we can't use R because R is like a full string that's not delimited by anything. So since we want to have the username and the password delimited by a space, we need 2 times the character S, which represents 2 parameters of type string. Cool. Then we want to go to the header file. On the left hand side, you can click here to go to gamecontroller.h, and at the bottom of this file we also want to uncomment example here and rename it to register. So this should give us an account not yet. This should give us a command that is called register, and it does the same thing as the test command, so it sends a broadcast. We don't want to send a broadcast. We want to create a account. But, okay, so let's remove that line. But before we want to create an account, we want to make sure that this account does not exist yet. So let me quickly maybe in a comment document what the mission is. So we want a user to be able to type in the chat /register and then a username and a password, let's say foo and bar. This will then create a file with the username and the extension .txt. So this will create a file foo.txt in our storage location. So we are going to use the Teeworlds storage code. That means the storage.cfg file, as you remember, will determine where this file will be located in your current directory, in your user directory, or in some custom path. Okay, so far so good. So before we run the register command and actually create this foo.txt file and tell the user, hey, you created an account, we want to check if this foo.txt file is already there, and then yell at the user this account is already in use or already created. So how do we check if a file is existent? I didn't find any proper code in the Teeworlds code base that handles this. So we are just going to abuse the file reading code, and if it fails to read this file or opens it for reading, then it's probably not there. There could be other reasons why it fails for reading, but it should be fine enough. Okay, so how do we read a file? I don't remember by heart, but I remember parts of it, so I can press Ctrl+Shift+F to search the whole source code, and I want to search for open file, I think it was. Yes, so we want to use the function open file from storage, and as you can see, for example, here in server browser.cpp, we have a instance of it being used, also opening for reading. That's awesome, so we can just copy that line so that we don't have to type it out ourselves. Then let's go back to the game controller and just paste it in here. Okay, that's how we open a file for reading, as you remember from the reading files episode. Here we have the file name, which is a variable that we copied over, so we don't have this variable defined here. So let's hardcode for now the username foo. Then the flag is reading, that's fine. Then the storage type we can ignore. So far so good. Okay, let's see if it compiles. Well, I know it does not compile, but I want to show you guys the error message. Right. So as you can see, it says in static member function, storage was not declared in the scope. So what this means is that we are using a function storage and it's not defined in this current scope. So as you remember, what scope are we in? We are currently in a iGameController function, but a special one, we are in a static game controller function. That means we don't have access to the game controller methods. Well, we basically have no access to anything, but via the p self we can access the game controller, since that's a pointer to an instance of a game controller class. So let's try that. And that doesn't work either, because it says class iGameController has no member named storage. That means that even though now we can access all the member functions of iGameController, there's no function called storage in iGameController. So if you control click on the class name, it's defined in gamecontroller.h. We can search for storage in here, and there's no occurrence. Maybe if you work in a different source base, there is an occurrence of storage in here, but I don't have any. So that's that. So let's look around. What else do we have? We can see up here we have a pointer to game server, and we are not supposed to use this variable up here, but we can use the wrapper around it, this so to say getter. If you come from Java, they have it a lot. So there's a function called game server, which will give us access to an instance of a cGameContext class. And if we control click that, as you can see, we have a m_p storage defined here. So that's something I added 2 weeks ago to the upstream code. Maybe if you run a different source code, if you are on a outdated Teeworlds code, you might not have it. Then you kind of want to make sure that you add it. So we want a variable class iStorage in here in cGameContext. Then we also want in the public section of this class, we want to expose the variable like this. And then as well in gameContext.cpp, we want to make sure that m_p storage is initialized in the function on init. And we do it like that with a request interface. Okay, you should have this code anyways, but I just wanted to mention it. Maybe you don't, because you run in a different source code. DDoS Network has this, and Teeworlds has this now too as well. But maybe you run some custom outdated source code, so I wanted to mention it. Okay, cool. That means, that was a long explanation, but that means that in iGame controller, we have the option to access the game server, which will then give us a pointer to a cGameContext instance, which then has a member function that exposes storage. Okay, so far so good. Let's give it a try again. And it's still not building. What is going on today? It says invalid use of incomplete type. You've seen that one already. Incomplete type means we are using the class iStorage in here, since we call the function openFile, which is part of iStorage. So we have to define it first. And iStorage is defined in storage.h. How do you figure it out? You press Ctrl P and search for storage. And we have to make sure that during the compilation of this code down here, that we have this class defined already. And the way we do it is we scroll to the top and we include engine storage. This will essentially put the code out of storage.h in here. And then if it compiles this file and it goes from top to bottom, it will have this class defined, which means we can use it down here. That's awesome. Let's give it a try. Does it build? And it builds now. As you can see, we still have a warning, unused variable. That's to be expected since our code is not finished yet. Awesome. So far so good. So let's do a check if the file exists. So if we get a valid file handle back, if it managed to open it for reading, well, it's not foo, let's call it foo.txt, it's account name.txt. So if it manages to open a file with the account name for reading, that means that this file exists. But since we are trying to register an account, we want to abort here. So we use the return keyword to stop execution, and then we want to yell at the user. How do we yell at the user? We use pself, then get the game server and send chat. In here we have our known parameters already. So we have first the person who sends the chat message. We use -1 as the server, then the mode chat all, public chat. Then we have the recipient. The recipient will be the person who executed the chat command. We have the client ID of the person who executed the chat command and our context that's defined up here. So we type in pcom context. Since it's a pointer, we need this arrow syntax -greater than. Then we have a member variable m_client ID in here. So this thing represents the client ID of the person who executed the command. And as last parameter, we have the message that is being sent in the chat, and we say something like account already exists. Awesome. Cool. And since we managed to open the file for reading, make sure to close it as well after you used it. Cool. So far so good. So if the account is not created yet, then we run this code down here. If it was created already, then we manage to open it for reading and then we execute this code. The return keyword will abort the execution of the current function, so every code that's written in this function down here won't be executed anymore. It aborts it. Okay, so let's go. Down here we write the code, what happens when we successfully are creating an account. So how do we do that? We just open a file for writing and write in the account data. Okay, so let's copy this line up here, the reading line, and adjust it. First of all, we want to remove the data type since we don't want to redeclare the variable file, which is illegal. We want to reuse it and reassign it. Okay, then we don't want to open it for reading, but for writing. Okay, then we want to check if it manages to open it for writing. This time we check !file, not file. Here we check if it successfully opened it for reading, and here we check if it unsuccessfully opened it for reading. Note the exclamation mark, which is a negative operator, so if the file is not true, then we yell at the user again with some error message. So we use the return keyword because something went wrong with opening the file. So we copy the chat command, the chat message line here, and instead of saying account already exists, we say something went wrong. This is a bit unspecific, but if you think about it, we kind of checked if the file is not there yet, so we want to create it, and if it fails to open it for writing, something has to be horribly wrong. For example, your storage location is a invalid path, your file system is full, you have missing permission. Well, if this fails once, it's likely that it will fail for everybody, and it's not clear what happened. So that's a worst case scenario that we kind of want to cover, because catch all the errors. Okay, but if it didn't fail, then we continue down here. So what do we do next? We fill the file up with some data. So the way I thought about structuring account files is we have like one value per line, the first line being the username, then the password, then the XP, and then the level. Okay, so how do we write data? We use io_write, as you remember from the file writing episode. It takes as a first argument a file handle, which is in our case named file, and the second parameter, it takes a value, like a void pointer. Wait, where is it? A void pointer to a buffer. We can just hard code some string in here. For example, our account will be named foo, and then we have the size. So let's use a string length of foo. Okay, so this will write the string foo in the first line of the account file, and the account file is called foo.txt. So I'm currently hard coding in a account name in here, also the file path. We will later switch that out with a variable so that we can take custom account names. I just want to leave it in here for simplicity purposes and that you really understand which value is in here. So foo is the account name the user picked, and we are literally hard coding it in here. So whatever the user types in as a register command, all the accounts will be called foo. Currently, we will change that. Okay, anyways, so we write in the first line of the file the username. Let's document that with a comment, username. And then we do the same thing again with a password, and our password will be bar. And we also want to separate that with a new line. So we do io_write a new line, which only takes a file handle. Cool. And after that, we want to write in some XP. Or in what order is it? So let's go to our player.h file. So we have XP first in our account data struct. Make sure you have at the bottom of player.h this struct that we defined in the level system episode. Okay, so we type in 0 as a initial value for our XP. Since if you create a fresh account, it will have XP of 0 and level of 0. Also separate that by a new line. And after you successfully written to the file, make sure to close it. Then we also want to print a message to the user and say something like account created. You can now log in. So that's not happening at the same step. So you register an account, and as next step you have to log in. We could also do it in one step, but I like promoting the login command to users so they know how to log in the next time. Okay, I hope that works. Let's give it a try. Let's see if the server builds. It does. Let's run the server. And what we expect to happen now is that we can type in /register and type in whatever in here, since we currently ignore our parameters, and it should create a file called foo.txt with some sample account data. Okay, let's try it. Account created, you can now log in. So that error message, it's not the error message, that success message looks fine so far. Okay, that's awesome. Now we can try rerunning it again. Now we expect it to fail, and it should say like, hey, this account was created already. It does. It says account already exists. That is awesome. Okay. Yeah, so let's look in my current directory. I hope I don't confuse you with my terminal. Do we have a foo.txt in here? No, we don't, because as you remember from the storage episode, from the file writing episode, we have a storage system that defines where stuff is being written to, and at the top of the server log, like at the beginning of the server log, you see it's the user directory that we are using as a storage path. So it's not the current directory, but I would like to have my stuff in here for now. So let's real quick change that and copy a storage file from outside of the build directory in here. Just wait, like this. Well, maybe let's not do it over the terminal. Let's do it in a graphical environment. So this is our source code, our whole like repository. We have our src folder here. This is our build folder where I run my server and compile it. On Windows, maybe you have some out folder or however it's called. And in here we have a file that's called storage.cfg, and we want to copy that into the build folder. So we go into the build folder and paste it in here, because in here is my server and I want it next to the server. Then we want to edit the storage.cfg file to have the current directory at the top. By the way, I use the option key and arrow keys to move lines. Okay, so that should now write the file to the current directory. We can quickly check if it did write it to my user directory if we do cat foo in here, and it does. Okay, awesome. So it created a file, and in the first line it wrote foo, in the second bar, and then 00, but it's like in my app data roaming directory, not in my current directory. So keep that in mind. Okay, that works. What do we do next? Let's replace those hard-coded values foo.txt with the actual user input. Since right now you can type whatever you want as a parameter to the register command, and it will name every account foo and use bar for every password. We don't want to do that. We want to replace foo.txt with whatever the user typed in as a first parameter .txt. Since we kind of want to concatenate two strings, like whatever the user typed in, and .txt, we have to use string format. So let's create a buffer, done it a zillion times, make it big enough, and use string format. First argument being the buffer, then the size of the buffer. And then we have the user input .txt as a format string, and the last parameter of the string format function will be whatever variable we want to put in this %s. So that should be a string that the user typed in coming from this parameter, the first s. How do we access that? We have a variable p result up here that we can access, and out of that boy we can get string. And which string do we want? The first one. So in parentheses we put 0, since we start counting from 0. This will take then whatever the user typed in as a first parameter, put it in here. So if the user typed in foo, it will put foo in here. If the user typed bar, it will be bar. So this is a placeholder. Awesome. Then we have our above string that we can use and put it in here, and down here I'm using Ctrl D to have multiple cursors after I highlighted a certain text. Wonderful. Okay. Also down here we don't want to hardcode foo. We don't want to use above because we don't want to have the .txt in the file. So the file name will be foo.txt, but the first line of the file will only be foo, only the username without the extension. So above is too much. We only want the username, so that's in p result get string 0. Awesome. Down here, instead of hard coding bar as the password, we want the second parameter that the user gave to this chat command. So we type in get string and 1. So this get string 1 is referring to this s, the second parameter the user typed in. Cool. So now we should be able to type in a custom username, a custom password, and depending on what we typed in, it will create a file and we'll fill it accordingly. Okay, so let's not test it because our code is working. Duh, you should definitely test it, but I'm confident it works now. So let's copy the register command and start working on the login command. So call that login. This format is the same. We have username, password, and it will then read a file depending on the username. Okay, we don't do any file writing in here. Can delete that. We also don't open a file for writing. Well, essentially we only need the reading code. We only want to open a file for reading and load the account data. So maybe before we start implementing the whole login function, let's define it properly here. So let's copy the add command line and replace register with login, and the help text will be login to an account, whatever. It also takes two parameters, the username and the password, and it will link to this function called login, which we also have to define in the gamecontroller.h. So at the bottom of gamecontroller.h, we want to copy register and call it login. Awesome. Okay, so we have the same file format in here. It's what the user typed in as a first parameter, getString0, the first s, and append a txt to it. Then we try to open this file for reading, but this time it's a bit the other way around. The last time we used opening for reading as an error case. This time it's the success case. So we swap this out. If it failed to open for reading, then we say something like account does not exist. Well, it could have other reasons as well. As I told you, you can also fail to open a file for reading, even if the file is there, maybe missing permission or something. But if the server is configured properly and if it fails to open a file for reading, well, an account file for reading, then it's most likely that the account does not exist. So this error message is totally descriptive. Okay, cool. Then down here we have the path, well, not the path. Down here we have the code that's being executed when the file successfully opened for reading, because if it did not open for reading, then we fail here and abort execution of the function. Cool. So what do we do if we open it for reading? We kind of want to load all the data again. As you remember, we load data with some boy that is called line reader. So Ctrl+Shift+F for C line reader in the source code and steal it from your favorite location. Let's maybe go in here. Does that, whoa, oh no, that's the definition, that's bad. Console, yeah, that looks fine. So let's steal some code from engine shared console.cpp and copy this boy. Okay, so you don't have to know every line of code by heart. You just have to know where to find it. This is not a test, this is the real world. If you know how to find code and copy it, you don't need to know it by heart. Okay, so kind of want to show you how I would do it. Okay, awesome. As you can see, the C line reader is not green. That means we have a class in here that we are not including yet. So let's do that. Where is it located? Line reader is located under engine shared. So let's do include engine shared line reader.h. Awesome. And as you can see, it now is highlighted properly. Last episode we called our line reader instance LR. Maybe it's a bit less confusing if we use the same name in here. You can call it however you want, because like this is just a local variable that's living in this scope. You can pick a name and yeah, nobody cares. Just be consistent. You have to use the same name 3 times. Okay, anyways, so we create an instance of a line reader object, we initialize it with the file, and then we get a pointer to a character and iterate over the file. We kind of don't want to iterate over the file because this console code that we stole does not know how long the file will be, and it will go over every line and just execute it. But what we want to do is a bit different. We exactly know how many lines there should be in an account file. It should be always 4 lines, username, password, and XP and level. And we kind of want to handle every line specifically and move its value to a specific location. So instead of calling it in a while loop, we kind of want to call lr.get multiple times. So this will give this will give us the first line, this will give us the second line, and so on. Okay. So what do we do now? Before we start loading some data, let's extend our account struct defined in the player class. So let's go to player.h or Ctrl+P, player.h. It's located under game server. At the bottom of the file, you should have in the public scope a struct called cAccountData that you created in the last episode. If not, just write it down yourself. And we kind of want to extend it with a username and a password. So we initialize the username. Well, maybe let's do it the right order. So we create a variable in here that's called m_a username. The m stands for member variable, since it's a member of the struct. The a stands for array, since the username is a string, so it will be an array of characters. The maximum length of the username is like 128 characters, whatever. And then we do the same with the password. Okay. And in the constructor, which will be called when we create an instance of that struct, we want to initialize the username to a empty string. So we index the first element out of the string and set it to a null byte. As you remember, strings are terminated by null bytes. So everyone who's working with those strings will iterate over them and will stop handling the string, or will recognize the end of the string if it finds a terminating null character. So if we set the first element of the string to be the end of the string, we essentially create an empty string. There's no need to empty all the other 128 elements in that array, since it's terminated at the beginning already. Okay, so far so good. Let's do the same with the password. Initialize it to an empty string. Awesome. Well, this now gives us the possibility to load whatever is in this file into our account struct. So how do we access our account struct? We need an instance of a player object. As you remember, we are in player.h, which is of type class player, C player. So that's a instance of a player object. We kind of want to access one of those. Which one exactly? We want the player object of the person who executed the login command. So how do we get the player object of the person who executed the command? What information do we have? We have pcon context, the client ID. So we have a client ID and we want a player instance. The way we approach this is, first of all, let's create a pointer to a player instance. So we write out the name of the class cPlayer, which is the data type of our variable. Then we make it a pointer with a star. We call it pPlayer since it's a pointer. And then we assign it to the value of what? Where do we have all our players? I can tell you it's in pself, since it's not in the static function. So we always want to do pself if we want to call someone external. And it's in our favorite class game server, which has one big ass array that's called m_ap players, which stands for array of pointers of players. So it's an array of pointers pointing to player instances of the type cPlayer. And at the index of the client ID, we have the corresponding player object. So we can just slap in the player ID in the in the square brackets. So this will index the player with this ID, and this whole thing will then return a player instance that we save in a variable pPlayer. Awesome. So now down here, after this line, we can use the variable pPlayer and access our account data struct. Awesome. And with the dot syntax, since it's not a pointer, so you have pointer versus like by value, I don't know how it's called. There you access member attributes with the dot. And we have our username, password, level, XP. Awesome. Cool. So the first line of our account file, as you remember, is the username. So we want to set the username to the value of the first line. So something like that. Sadly, this doesn't work, since in C and C++ strings are a bit more complex, so you can't just assign it with an equals. We need our string copy function. How do we do that? We type in string copy. We have the destination, which will be our account struct. Then we have the source, which will be lr.get, which is the first line of the file. And then we provide the size of the destination using the size of macro. Cool. So what this line now does is it takes the first line, since this is the first call to get of the line reader instance, and saves it to the account struct, and specifically in the member variable username. So that is pretty awesome. Okay, then we kind of want to do the same thing with the password. So let's press Ctrl D again to edit it at the beginning and the end. Awesome. So now we loaded the username and the password into the account struct. The next thing that we want to do is, before we keep loading all the data like XP and level and continue our way, we kind of want to check if the user typed in the correct password, right? Otherwise everybody could log in. So how do we do that? With a sum if statement. And we want to compare the password that we just loaded into our account struct using string compare. So we type in string compare. It's called string comp because lazy typers. The first argument being A, the second one being B. So we compare these two strings. So we type in the password that was loaded from the file, and we compare it to whatever the user provided us with as a parameter. So we type in p-result get string, and as you remember, the password is the second parameter, the second s, so it's at index 1 since we start counting from 0. Okay, so string compare will return 0 if they are equal, and 0 is false in C++. So this will return true if the passwords do not match, right? If we want to check if they match, we use a exclamation mark to invert it, but we actually want to check if they don't match. So we omit the exclamation mark and make this a return. So in here, this code will be executed if the passwords do not match what the user provided as argument and what was loaded from the file. What do we do then? We kind of want to wipe out the account struct username, because we use this variable to check if a user is properly logged in. We kind of want to use that later. So let's do the same thing that we did in the constructor. We take the first element out of the username array and initialize it to a terminating null byte. Awesome. And then we stop execution. But we kind of also want to inform the user that he typed in the wrong password. So copy the line from up here and paste it down here. So we say something like wrong password. Awesome. We don't really have to wipe out the password. We can leave that dangling because, well, we will just overwrite it with the new value if the user logs in again. Okay, so if that didn't fail, we continue down here. And what do we do then? We continue loading data. So let's do this boy again. Oh, it's not a string copy. My fault. So the next value that we want to load is in pplayer account data is the XP. Is that the right order? Let's keep it consistent. Yes, XP level, username, password, XP level. Okay, and we assign it to lr.get, which won't work because the XP is a integer and linereader.get is a string. But C has us covered, so there's a function called array, which stands for array to integer, I think, since like strings are arrays of characters and integers are integers, so it's called array to integer, which could also be read as string to integer. So if you have like the string 1, 2, 3, it will iterate over it and like look at the characters and then turn it into an integer that is then 1, 2, 3 without the quotes. Cool. And then we can assign it. So we do the same for the last line, which will be saved into level. Awesome. One more thing we kind of want to tell the user that it worked when it worked. So we send another chat message and say like, logged in. Okay, exciting times. I guess it's time to test some code. So go in here and run the build command. Oh, whoa, we have an error. Class C game context has no member m. Yeah, I did a typo. It's not m_AP player, but AP players, plural, of course. It also tells us, did you mean AP players? It's so helpful, these error messages. So if you typed along character by character, you might have it as well. So it's in here, m_AP players. Awesome. Let's see if it builds. Bam. It successfully compiled. There's one more thing that just came to my mind. We are not closing the file that we open here for reading inside of the login method. We want to close it at the end of the file. So we do IO close file. Whoops. Make sure that IO close is after the last call to linereader.get, and you don't call linereader.get after the IO close. Obviously, you can't read from a file that's been closed, so that's bad. But after you finished reading from it, make sure to close it. It works without the closing and it won't complain, but it's bad code, so don't do it. Okay, let's see if it works. Let's compile it again and join some server. Whoops, did I just ban myself? Yes, I banned myself. Awesome. Okay, so let's create some account. We can type in /register, and this time it will actually pick up whatever we type in as a parameter. Last time it said like, well, we are going to use foo whatever you type in. Okay, so let's pick some awesome username and use the username test and the password test as well. Awesome. It says account created, you can now log in. That's awesome. Does it still work if I try to do it again? No, it says account already exists. That's awesome. So if I type in /login test and a wrong password, it should say wrong password. That's awesome. If I do login test and a correct password, which is also test, it should say logged in. So everything works as expected. And if we now look into the current directory, since we changed the storage path, we have, well, that's an old file. We have a file called test.txt in here, and it has the username and the password and XP and level. Awesome. I love it. Cool. So there's one more step missing, and that's actually saving the data. Since you can register an account and you can log into it, but if you leave the server, your data won't be saved. So whatever data you track in your account, it will successfully be loaded but not be saved, if you know what I'm talking about. And the way we do it is we kind of want to check every time a player disconnects, hey, is this boy logged in? If yes, we want to save its data. Okay, so where do we do that? We do it in our awesome game controller, in mymod.cpp, or however you call your game controller. If you don't have a game controller because you didn't follow along in the game controller episode, you can also put it directly in gamecontroller.cpp. And let's have a look where players disconnect. So let's go to the gamecontroller.h and skim the file for method names that ring a bell. And as you can see, we found onPlayer connect and onPlayer disconnect in here. It's in gamecontroller.h, like, well, just scroll around or Control F for onPlayer disconnect. So this is the function that we want to use, and we want to put our code in there. If you have a virtual key in front of here, you can use it in your own controller, like the MyMod controller. If you don't have a virtual key in here, you can't. So we kind of want to put it in here so that we can override this function. If you don't use our own controller, well, you can ignore the step. If the virtual key is the virtual keyword is already there, you can also ignore the step. Okay, so on player disconnect, we can just copy this function and put it into mymod.h. Well, you might not have this file. Follow along the game controller episode. Cool. and paste it in here, and that's fine. Then we go to mymod.cpp and we put in the function. We want to prefix the function name with C. How did this class? C game controller my mod, or however your class is being called. You can see it in the H file. The class name is here, or like look at the other functions. Okay, so we also kind of want to call the parents function, so we want to pass it on to the other game controller. So let's invoke a call to iGameController on player disconnect, and we pass on the player variable that we get passed in as a parameter in here. So what this does is it calls the onPlayerDisconnect function inside of gamecontroller.cpp. Since we overwrote it in our controller, this code will be essentially deleted, and our code will be run instead, but we also want to still run this code since, well, it's important for the functionality of a basic Teeworlds server. That's why we also call on this code. By the way, if you don't have your own controller, you can put your code just inside here, your code. Awesome. But we want to have it in our own controller, so we will continue working here. And we call onPlayerDisconnect after we save the account, as opposed to here where we did call on character death and then we did our stuff. Because this time we kind of want to make sure that the player is not destroyed yet and the player object is not deleted yet before we take variables out of it and save it to a file. So, well, order matters. If you think about it, you want to save to the account file before you disconnect, not after you disconnect. Okay, so how do we save the data? We can just steal our own code. Well, you can see it's becoming a pattern. Steal code. It's very helpful. So which code are we going to steal? We steal the register code. And instead of like registering an account and filling it up with empty values, we kind of want to use the values that the player has. So you will see in a second. So let's just copy over this boy in here and adjust it. A buff, we don't have that. How did we define a buff? So let's copy that over as well. Okay, so we don't have the variable pResult get string 0, since that was coming from the chat command. How do we access the username of the player if we only have a player instance? Well, it's in our account struct. So as you remember, in the player class we have our account struct, and in there we save the username. So out of that struct we can yeet the username. Wait, which file? mymod.cpp. So we do player, which is passed into this function, which is the current player who's disconnecting. We access our account data struct, and then we access the username. We will append a .txt file and try to open it for writing. Awesome. There's one more step we want to do, is we do not want to save data of users that are not logged in. And to check if a user is logged in, we just look at the first byte of that string, or the first character of that string, and be like, hey, is this a null byte? If it's a null byte, that means that the username is empty, which it is by default, but it will be only filled if you successfully logged in. As you remember from the login command, that's where we set this username in here. And if it failed to log in, we also unset it again. So if a user is not logged in, this byte will be 0. So in this case, we kind of want to return and just stop whatever we are doing here. Well, maybe not return, since then we don't call on disconnect. We can just wrap this whole boy in curly braces. Always forget how these are called. Okay, so wait, and then we have to switch around the logic. So if the first character is not a null byte, so if there's a username, then we want to execute the saving code. and in any case we want to call on player disconnect afterwards. That's why we can't use the return keyword. Okay. Also, we don't want to do this something went wrong here. We want to refactor that to an else, since we can't return. Okay. Code looks a bit uglier now, but it's still okay. Awesome. So, what else do we have to adjust? We use the variable pself, which is not defined in here. As you remember, pself in the chat command is defined up here. And we actually don't need pself. Since we are not in a static function, we can just access game server directly. So let's remove all occurrences of pself. Let's have a look. The client ID is also not in pcom context, but we can receive it out of the player object. So we do pplayer and get client ID. Oh, anyways, if the file open fails for writing, we actually don't want to yell at the user, because the user is currently disconnecting. He won't be able to see it anyways. So maybe we just log it for the server admin. So we do dbg_message accounts, or well, my mod. You can put in whatever you want in here, and then let's say failed to save account. So if something goes wrong and the server admin checks the logs, the server admin will see, hey, account failed to save. Let's have a look and investigate. Awesome. Cool. So we save the username and the password, but we don't have those variables. The username is inside of pplayer. Then the account struct, and then m_username. Same goes for the password. Okay, so far so good. And now exciting stuff is going to happen. Instead of writing a 0, we want to write the actual XP that the user collected. But we can't write a integer into a file because files are strings. So we have to turn our integer into a string. How do we do that? We use string format. As you remember from the file writing episode, we just abuse our buffer size of that we defined up here. So we don't have to define a new buffer, and use the %d format string, which stands for digit, I suppose. And then we pass in pplayer, account data, and then XP. So this will take the variable XP, which is an integer, and inside of the format string, well, we expect one integer and we do nothing else. So it will essentially convert this integer to a string and fill it in the variable a buff. And now, instead of writing a 0, we can write a buff, which holds the XP as a string. Then we do the same thing again. We reuse the variable a buff, and instead of formatting it to XP, we format the level. And then instead of writing a 0, we write a buff. Whoops, copied the wrong thing. We write a buff. And after that, we successfully close the file. We could also print a message for the server admin. Well, if you want to be extra verbose, saved account, whatever. Awesome. So let's do some testing. Keep in mind that this my mod code is only being run if you have this game mode active. So if you put it in a game controller, well, it will always be run. But if you use your own controller, make sure you set the game type accordingly, otherwise this code won't be run. Okay, so let's do that. It does not build. Awesome. Well, that was a classic. Virtual outside class declaration. Oh, okay, yeah, well, I copied the virtual. As you can see, it says virtual outside class declaration. So what does it mean? It does not like the virtual, and it's outside of the class declaration. So the class declaration is here, and here we are allowed to use the virtual keyword, and here we don't, since, well, nobody does it. So let's remove the virtual key. And then we have another error. file was not declared in the scope because we used the variable file up here and we didn't declare it since we stole our code and we didn't adjust it accordingly. So we want to type an IO handle in here to use the data type and declare the variable file. Where we stole the code from, we already had the variable declared and we only were reusing it. But here we have to declare it again. Awesome. And then we have another one, invalid use of incomplete type class iStorage. Seen that one plenty of times now. So what do? We want to include the storage stuff. It's under include engine share. Wait, no storage. Whoops. That's it. The other one is also from iStorage. Okay, so let's see if it builds now. It does. Awesome. So let's run the server. Don't forget to set the game type with sv_game type. You can also do that via recon or via your config, however you want, but make sure to set the game type accordingly to your game type. And yeah, let's get right into it. You only have to set the game type if you have your own controller. If you use it, the other game controller or CPP, you don't, as I said. Anyways, so let's see if that works. So what should happen now, if we log into our account, login test, we should be able to make some kills now and gain some XP. And if we disconnect, that XP should be saved. So let's give it a try. So we made 1 kill, so we have 1 XP. The second XP should level us up. Oh, where's the boy? Okay, so now we are level 1. Let's do some more killing. So now we have 3 XP. And now we have 4 and we are level 2. So now when we disconnect, it should say in the server log, saved account. That's awesome. And if we reconnect, and do a login test, it should save, well, not save, it should load our XP and level. So if we do some more killing, we shouldn't be leveling up to level 1 again. We should continue at level 3. So I need 2 kills to level up. Give me 1 more kill. And as you can see, it says now level up, you're now level 3 in the chat. Since it loaded our level and XP when we typed in login, and when we disconnect, it will save it. So if we have a look at the file, we open the current directory in VS Code, we can see we have our test account in here. It has like 4 XP and 2 levels. So now when we disconnect, because we found some more level, didn't I? Yeah. So now when we disconnect, it should update it. Bam. Now we have 7 XP and we are level 3. And if we log in again, it will load this data. Okay. This is how you create a account system, how you store some data, how you load it, how you autosave and disconnect. It is a lot to take in. So congrats to you guys who ever watched this whole episode to the end and understood something of it. Yeah, have fun with that and see you in the next episode.